Hi, I'm Elizabeth Townsend Guard. I'm a law professor at Tulane University Law School, and this is Just Wanna Quilt because I just wanna quilt. I'm a law professor. I just said that. I focus on copyright. We're going to read a little bit about the book I wrote, Just Wanna Create, Copyright and Fair Use Strategies. We're on Chapter 2, which is why we create. It's all about quilting and creating and getting us into the mood. It's about an hour long. I hope you enjoy it. And if you don't, that's okay too. But let's learn a little bit about why we quilt and why we create. This is based on interviews that I did over a number of years, about 2 or 3 years, and also our Facebook group where people answered questions about why they quilt. You'll hear their voices throughout the book. It's part of my favorite part of this project is that it is a combination of both interviews with industry leaders and also with us regular quilters and fancy quilters in the Facebook group. Come join our Facebook group if you want, and I hope you enjoy Chapter 2. Why we create. Chapter 2. Understanding copyright law means understanding the context of where that law is being applied. The basic questions, who, what, where, and why, and matter, and how and what part of the copyright law applies. This is true for any art. For this book, we are going to look at art quilting to understand the legal issues, but many of the questions may apply to any art medium. Copyright law governs creative works of our world. The paintings, literature, film, quilts, street graffiti, woodworking, software, and music, to name a few. Copyright also governs our everyday activities, posting photographs on Instagram, Pinterest, and Facebook, for example, and all kinds of other things that we do. Copyright governs fan works, piracy, and appropriation art. Copyright also allows for Google searches, recording TV shows to watch later, and making copies of software onto your computer. Copyright law does a lot of heavy lifting. And yet in our world, because of the structure of the systems, copyright law is not as straightforward or obvious as studying for a driving test. It is more nuanced, complicated, and often includes a risk assessment of how likely someone is to sue or react badly to an unauthorized user. Copyright, in short, is weird. We all interact with copyright every day, and yet most of us will not get involved in any copyright scuffle, or even if we are technically committing copyright infringement. Copyright involves many questions, not only about the object, but how we are using the object. Let's look at the quilting world as an example. Are you trying to mass produce quilts outside the United States? Are you making charity quilts? Are you a hobbyist that enters quilt shows? Are you reproducing a quilt from the 1800s? Are you a fabric designer with a particular look to your designs? Quilting can mean many things, and depending on the circumstances, the relationship of the law to the endeavor may alter. This is always true with copyright. Copyright is about relationships with creative works. We start with the act of creating, and more specifically, for our example, creating quilts. So I asked the Quilting Army, those are our people in our Facebook group, what is it? What is quilting, and why do we quilt? Let's hear their responses. What is quilting? Quilting can be described by its utility, a blanket for keeping one warm. In this way, quilting can be described by its outcome. Quilting can also be described as a series of 3 layers of fabric. The top, made in a variety of ways, including bits of fabric sewn together, one whole piece of cloth, sometimes with pieces of fabric sewn on top of it, and so much more. It's a piece of art. The middle, usually batting, soft, with various thickness. The bottom, the back. This again has a wide variety, but it is larger than the first 2 layers until it's finished, and can be pieced from a variety of fabrics or be one big piece of fabric. Holding it all together. This can be quilted. Yes, that is what it's called. Where the 3 layers, either by machine or by hand, are put together or tied with pieces of thread and connected again together. The stitching can be simple or very complicated. Layers of creativity create warmth, art, and beauty. Quilting can also be described as a means of creating art that was quilted. But quilting is much more than the outcome. It's a way of life, a passion, and an obsession for many. This is true of many art forms. When we asked the Quilting Army what is quilting, they said not only these practical things, but also, quote, justification for being a fabric hoarder, Monica Dage Faro. My life, Ilsa Van Cocker. A form of sewing and art, relaxation, therapy, usually after being finished with something that was stressing me out or out by not going right, Julia Driscoll. Medication for the soul, Tracy Phillips. A socially acceptable obsession, obsessive-compulsive disorder, Beth Hennon Strand. And my own, materializing love. So quilting from the beginning is much more than putting 3 layers of fabric together and stitching them together. This complex of art, purpose, and beauty is found in many forms. We have to understand this to understand how copyright intersects with what we do. And so, quilting is an art form, building someone else's puzzle, therapy, community, shopping, sharing love and giving, a skill and a talent and a frustration and a joy, a $5 billion industry, our history, our obsession, our identity, political, apolitical, religious, agnostic, our family business, our livelihood, our hope that someday we will retire and do nothing else, our escape from the pressures of our everyday life, all of these things and more. Quilting is full of processes, steps, habits, traditions, field trips to quilt shows, repeats, quilt stores, shows, retreats, friends' houses, classes, guild meetings, and learning. It is also filled with creative choices, fabric, designing, quilting, learning new techniques, and the sheer will to complete a project or not. Creative choices are where copyright comes in. Sewing solo within a larger community. Quote, I make quilts for family and friends. While I do enjoy my solitude while working in my studio, I also love working with my quilting friends. We always have so much fun catching up, sharing what we're working on, sharing tips, laughing, eating, laughing some more. We may not be productive on the project we brought to work on, but we always feel so good when we leave to go home. Dina Martin, August 9th, 2019. I quilt primarily by myself and enjoy that. However, I also occasionally quilt with my guildmates and quilty friends, and it's some of my most favorite times. Smiley face. I'm way less productive in terms of quilting, but more productive in terms of filling my needs for community. Jessica Plunkett, August 9th, 2019. For many creatives, we create on our own, working solo. Quilters are the same. We are often lone quilters, working at all hours of the day and night. I'm one of those. I love quilting on my own with Patrick and Remy the cats. But even lone quilters sometimes venture out to quilt shows, guilds, classes, shops, and retreats, to name a few spaces. Quilters are also part of a community of creatives that guide and influence their work. My friend and neighbor Judy Walker, who surrounds herself with and creates community wherever she goes and often drops into my lone space, not only works as a quilt shop, but is part of at least 2 local guilds, but also 2 family guilds, yes, 2, that have annual retreats. Quilt guilds. Many join local and national quilt guilds, and sometimes even online. These can range from a few people to thousands. The Modern Quilt Guild has branches and national conferences, the QuiltCon, each year, and locally in New Orleans we have many guilds and groups. Mostly women gather once a month on a Saturday or on an evening. They talk about quilting, organize charity events, plan retreats, and often have quilt projects as part of the meeting. And of course, there's show and tell. Judy's world is filled with a whole quilting world. Family guilds, local guilds, and she organizes the vendors for our regional quilt show, which is an organization of over 40 guilds in 4 states. I feel lucky to be in her world in a small way. In many ways, Judy is our guide to the community aspect of Just Want to Quilt. We have done so much in our community building because of the ideas from Judy, and we are all richer for that. Some find community, as Judy did, in their families. Quote, quilting is a family tradition as my mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother all quilted. My sister and I both do. I've tried lots of crafts and now just quilt. It's very satisfying. Mary Pritchard Ferber. And Ann Collins writes, all of the above. I started very young with my grandmother with a needle and thread, watching her cut pieces, using sandpaper or cardboard. In the final years of her life, her sight was failing, but she never stopped. I remember her taking a piece of fabric and folding it to create perfect squares. So for me, it is a passion and a privilege to continue for her. For me, quilting has also been connected to my family too. My mom, to begin, but when I started quilting again in the 2000s, my now seasoned husband would help me design quilts, including my favorite, this Christmas quilt we made. And then once my kid was around 5, Sid became my quilting partner, joining in on shopping, sewing, and designing. Others find community in their friends, in their guilds, in their coworkers, and others. We see retreats year after year of groups of friends and guilds. Some, like Liz Lesher, meet with a friend every week to spend time, in her case quilting, while her friend does another craft. For most of us, there is a balance. Linda Newman explains, I'm kind of an introvert, so really enjoy quilting on my own with an audiobook or music playing. But I do participate in a small friendship group, and we do handwork, binding, and embroidery, and a couple of retreats a year. I love the feedback and collaboration of a retreat. Our images of olden times, a technical term, of course, are of women sitting around sewing together in quilting bees in quilting bees. Some of our quilting army have stories and memories from their childhood of this experience. Anne Vandermeer recalled, my first quilting experience was at the Vermont Quilt Festival in 2003. I sat with a group of women and participated in hand quilting on a frame. They loved it. I was 12, turning 13 at the time. Megan Patton Nygren remembers, my grandmother led a community of quilters in the church I grew up in. They met, actually still do, regularly to make quilts for Lutheran World Relief and local charities. 5 to 6 people would be sewing, a few cutting squares, someone pressing, and some tying quilts. In the summer, I would help. And Camille Ainsworth tells a story that reminds us of that olden times, that olden times is not that long ago. It wasn't until we moved to Oregon in 1996 that I was able to see a group quilting on quilts using a frame. My mom joined a local church group while she was working part-time at their quilting bee. Every Friday, the ladies would set up their 2 frames in the community room of the church and stitch for 2 to 3 hours on the quilts. They had a list of everyone in the group, and they rotated quilts on the frame once the current quilt was finished. Part of their service was to make quilts for the church to raffle off each year. I had the opportunity to go to a couple of times and try my hand at hand quilting. Being only 14, I didn't appreciate the experience, and what I was doing was a tradition that went back hundreds of years. So after the 2013 Boston Massacre bombing, April 15th, 2013, I took Sid, my kid, to the New England Quilt Museum in Lowell, Massachusetts, because there was a community sewing day to contribute to a memorial quilt of that event. The artist Clara Wainwright was creating a quilt entitled Mending Boston. We lived in New Orleans, and the sewing day was some 1,500 miles north in Massachusetts. So we planned our trip to visit the family to coincide with this event. I wanted Sid to have the experience of quilting with others for a reason and a purpose. Sid was about 10 at the time, and in the picture, she's the one standing. So we stayed for hours. We had an amazing afternoon. This was long before I met Pam Weeks, now curator of the New England Quilt Museum, but we've talked about this experience often. We had an amazing afternoon. I often wonder if we saw Pam that day, she now being a dear friend. There is also a middle space of community in quilting, held together by meetings and by technology. We share our ideas, plans, and aspirations